September 3, 1945. The transport truck rumbled as its engine fought against the desert heat, dust rising in thick clouds behind the convoy. The road stretched endlessly ahead through the New Mexico plains, shimmering in waves of heat that made the horizon dance. Inside the covered bed, Japanese prisoners sat in silence, their bodies swaying with each jolt over the rough terrain. They had been told they were being taken to their fate, perhaps to labor camps in mines, perhaps to face harsh punishment for their defiance. Some whispered that Americans would treat them like animals, creatures unworthy of the emperor's honor. Yet, as the truck slowed and finally stopped with a hiss of brakes, what first filled their vision was not the stark geometry of prison towers, nor the menacing profile of armed fortifications, but a figure. He stood beside a wooden corral, one hand resting on a fence post, a wide-brimmed hat casting shadow across his weathered face, the glint of leather boots and silver buckle catching the unforgiving sun. The Japanese prisoners pressed forward, peering through the canvas openings, squinting through exhaustion and disbelief. One murmured a word in halting English he had learned from propaganda materials: cowboy. He had seen them before, but only in American films that had been shown in Tokyo before the war, in the days when such things were still permitted. For most of these men, Hollywood had been a distant fantasy, a world as unreal as mythology. Yet here he stood in flesh and dust, framed by an endless sky that seemed to swallow their sense of confinement whole. As the truck gates dropped open with a metallic clang, the air rushed in thick with the smell of sagebrush, horses, and dry earth. It was not the smell of war, but the scent of a land vast and untouched. The prisoners climbed down stiffly, their boots meeting ground so different from the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima or the coral of Pacific atolls. They expected shouting, rifles thrust at them, harsh commands barked in anger. Instead, the guards, many of them ranchers and farmers pressed into military service, simply watched with calm attention. And there among them stood more men in those wide hats and worn leather, Americans who looked less like soldiers of conquest and more like figures from another time entirely. One prisoner later wrote in a hidden diary, "I believed we had been transported into one of those Western pictures. There were horses tied to posts, and the men who watched over us carried themselves not as conquerors, but as cattlemen observing new arrivals. Only we were the stock now." The irony cut deep. These were men who had fought believing in the divine superiority of Yamato's spirit, who had been willing to die rather than surrender, who had been taught that capture was the ultimate dishonor. Yet here, stripped of their weapons and their certainty, they faced Americans whose authority came not from shouting or violence, but from a quieter confidence born of open spaces. To the Japanese, accustomed to rigid military hierarchy and barked commands, the cowboys' relaxed posture and unhurried movements carried a different kind of power, one they had not been prepared to understand. A sergeant called out orders for them to form lines, but even as they obeyed with ingrained discipline, many could not stop staring at the vastness beyond. There were no towering walls, no claustrophobic compounds surrounded by layers of wire, just the prairie, the gentle roll of land under wind, and the distant shapes of cattle moving like clouds across the earth. They felt a strange vertigo. This was captivity, yes, but it was also a spaciousness entirely foreign to men who had lived their entire lives on a crowded island nation under total war mobilization. As they were marched toward the camp entrance, they saw the barbed wire fence, simple, almost casual compared to what they had imagined. The guard towers stood, but they seemed almost decorative, their platforms empty in the afternoon heat. Guards walked rather than marched, some even nodded to civilians who had gathered along the road to watch. Children sat on fence rails, curious eyes following these enemy soldiers. Women in bonnets fanned themselves, murmuring at the sight of young Japanese men no older than their own sons fighting overseas. It was a scene of contradictions. Enemies observed with the curiosity reserved for strangers, warriors transformed into spectacle. Inside, the camp sprawled more like a ranch complex than a prison. Wooden barracks stood in orderly rows, a central mess hall visible in the distance, and beyond it all, fields where the prisoners would soon be assigned to work. The first shock came when the smell of cooking reached them. Rice steaming, vegetables simmering, the rich aroma of food in abundance. For many, this was bewildering. They had been told America would starve them as punishment. Instead, the scent of plenty filled the desert air. One soldier whispered bitterly in Japanese, "My family eats grass and tree bark. What is this place? The cowboy who had first caught their attention still stood near the corral, as if observing their reactions with mild interest. He pushed his hat back slightly, wiped sweat from his brow, and spat into the dust with casual ease. That simple gesture struck deeper than any hostile act could have. It was not triumph but indifference, the bearing of a man utterly secure, unthreatened by their former power or their current helplessness. The Japanese were directed into their barracks, but even inside, conversation erupted in hushed, rapid exchanges. Some insisted this was deception, a temporary show before true cruelty would begin. Others spoke cautiously of what they had seen: work, food, perhaps even fair treatment. One young soldier, barely 20, sat on his assigned bunk and said quietly, "If this is imprisonment, it is unlike any imprisonment we were taught to expect." Outside, the sounds of ranch life continued. A dog barking in the distance, horses snorting and stamping, the lowing of cattle carried on the wind. The prisoners lay in their bunks listening, caught between relief and confusion. They had fought to expand the empire's reach across Asia. Yet here they found themselves, fed and guarded by men who seemed more legend than military, cowboys who lived freer at the edge of a fence than they had ever been in the armies of the emperor. Night fell with desert swiftness. The horizon glowed with the last remnants of daylight, and the prisoners watched through gaps in the barrack walls. The same cowboy stood by a lantern now, its golden light tracing the outline of his hat and shoulders. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of a guitar, playing a melody the Japanese did not recognize but somehow felt in their bones. For the first time since capture, the silence was not filled with despair but with profound confusion. The day had begun with certainty. Captivity meant degradation and suffering, yet by its end, uncertainty reigned. Was this land of cattle, endless sky, and cowboys truly their prison? Or was it, in some incomprehensible twist, a glimpse of a freedom they had never known in their regimented homeland? And as one prisoner wrote that night by the dim light of a carefully hidden stub of candle, he left words that would echo in his memory long after the war: "I fear less this barbed wire than the horizon beyond it. For the first time I wonder if we Japanese have been the ones living inside a cage all along." The first morning began with a bell, its clear ring cutting through the cool desert dawn and rousing the Japanese from uneasy sleep. They rose stiffly from their bunks, expecting meager rations of the kind they had survived on during the war's final months: watery rice gruel, perhaps a few pickled vegetables. Yet when they filed into the mess hall, the scene before them brought them to a halt. Long wooden tables held steaming bowls of rice, vegetables cooked in American style, bread that was impossibly white and soft, and cups of hot tea alongside something they had only heard about: coffee, dark and bitter. It was not luxury by American standards, but to men who had watched comrades starve on Pacific islands, who had themselves survived on handfuls of rice and whatever could be foraged, it was overwhelming abundance. Some hesitated at the serving line, unsure whether accepting food meant accepting defeat or collaboration. A guard, his hat tilted back on his head, gestured them forward with a simple motion. "Eat up," he said, though few understood his words. The tone was clear enough. One prisoner lifted a spoonful of rice to his mouth and closed his eyes. It was clean, properly cooked, warm. Another bit into the bread and felt tears prick his eyes. It was sweet, softer than anything he remembered from before the war. He whispered to his neighbor in Japanese, "My mother has not seen white rice in 3 years." Others nodded, chewing in guilty silence. Every bite was a reminder that their families back home were enduring starvation while they, the captured and dishonored, ate like men at peace. Word spread through letters home, carefully censored but full of hints that astounded recipients. One prisoner wrote, "Do not worry for my health, mother. I eat here better than I did as a child in the village." Another noted the endless coffee, a drink most had only tasted once or twice in their lives, now poured freely into tin cups without rationing. Some guards chuckled at the prisoners' amazement, commenting among themselves that this wasn't even special. It was what any working man in America might eat on an ordinary day. The barbed wire surrounded the camp, but beyond it the rhythms of ranch life soon drew the prisoners in. After breakfast, they were organized into work details, not for punishment, but for labor that the vast agricultural regions desperately needed. With American men overseas, the farms and ranches lacked hands. Now enemy soldiers carried water buckets, loaded hay onto trucks, mended fences under the blazing sun, and learned to handle livestock. At first there was resistance. Many prisoners believed manual labor was beneath the dignity of soldiers, even captured ones. Some tried to work slowly, hoping their defiance would prove the cruelty of their captors. Yet the guards rarely raised their voices. They demonstrated, pointed, and often worked alongside the prisoners. One cowboy, sweat staining his shirt, showed a young Japanese man how to secure a fence post properly. The prisoner watched, copied the motion awkwardly, and succeeded on the third try. Later in the barracks he admitted to a friend, "I have never seen a superior work beside those beneath him. It is strange." The pay was another shock. Each man received credit, about 80 cents per day, for his labor. They could spend it at the camp canteen on small items, toiletries, writing paper, even modest luxuries like chocolate or cigarettes. For men who had been taught they would be worked to death without compensation, this simple transaction felt surreal. One prisoner joked bitterly to his bunkmate, "I serve the emperor and received only duty. I work for a cowboy and receive money." What kind of world is this? Cultural exchanges multiplied in unexpected ways. On Sundays, some ranchers who employed prisoner work details offered them water with ice, a luxury most had never experienced. One elderly rancher in Arizona recalled years later how a Japanese prisoner had helped repair an irrigation system, then sat quietly on the porch steps, staring at the desert mountains. When asked through gestures what he was thinking, the young man said in broken English, "So much space. Japan very small." His voice carried wonder, not resentment. But the abundance brought internal conflict as well. Within the barracks, tensions arose. Some men grew uneasy, fearing they were being corrupted by comfort, losing their loyalty to the emperor and the spirit of Bushido. Others whispered that the Americans had no right to treat them well, that it was a humiliation worse than punishment, suggesting they were weak enough to be bought with food and kindness. A few hardliners clung stubbornly to imperial ideology, sneering at fellow prisoners who smiled during work or seemed to enjoy American meals. They called them traitors, men seduced by the enemy's false generosity. These tensions simmered, dividing prisoners between those who held to old beliefs and those who began to question what honor and strength truly meant. American officers noticed these divisions in their reports. Some camps separated the most militant prisoners, fearing they would intimidate or harm those who were adapting. But in daily life, the lines often blurred. A man could arrive at the camp declaring eternal loyalty to the emperor, and within weeks be humming cowboy songs he'd heard from guards, quietly enjoying his third cup of coffee at breakfast. The sensory details carved themselves into memory: the creak of saddle leather as cowboys rode along fence lines, the sizzle of bacon in the mess hall, the smell of hay and dust that clung to work clothes. These were the textures of free men's lives, yet the prisoners lived among them, experiencing America not as conquerors or tourists, but as unwilling guests who nonetheless found themselves changed. One prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "We feared brutality but none came. Instead they gave us food until we felt ashamed to eat more. They gave us work and paid us. They treated us as if we were still men with dignity. In their generosity I found not comfort but confusion." His words captured the heart of the paradox. How could an enemy show fairness when one's own leaders had demanded absolute sacrifice? How could captivity feel more human than service to the divine emperor? Yet even in this confusion, moments of unexpected connection emerged. A Texas guard once taught a Japanese officer how to rope a practice post during a break. The officer tried, failed, tried again, and finally succeeded on the fifth attempt. The Americans applauded. The guard later joked, "That was the only Japanese officer I ever saw smile about failing." For the prisoners, such moments brought both shame and strange relief, a recognition that the world they had been taught to despise was not only stronger but somehow gentler in spirit than they had imagined possible. By the time autumn arrived, the camp's routines felt established: work details, meals, letters home, occasional baseball games watched with curiosity through the fence. But beneath the surface, the shock of abundance still gnawed. They ate meat while their families ate whatever could be scavenged. They drank endless coffee while mothers and wives stood in ration lines for rice mixed with sawdust. Each meal was both gift and wound. One evening after a long day of work, A group of prisoners lingered by the fence as the sun set over the plains in brilliant orange and purple. Beyond the wire, a cowboy adjusted his horse's saddle, the leather creaking in the quiet. He looked up, caught their eyes, and tipped his hat, a gesture of simple courtesy, before riding off into the twilight. One prisoner whispered in Japanese, "He works harder than we do, yet he is free. Why do they treat us better than our own officers ever did?" The question hung heavy in the cooling air. The men returned to their barracks in silence, unsettled. They were full of food and given dignity, yet empty of answers to the questions that had begun to haunt them. And as the lights went out across the camp, more than one lay awake wondering if this is how America treats its enemies, then how free must its own people truly be. The days lengthened not with monotony but with unexpected discoveries. Within the barbed wire, life took on rhythms that felt almost civilized, unsettlingly so for men who had expected only punishment. The barracks that smelled of desert dust and wood soon echoed with new sounds. The scratch of pencils on paper, the rustle of book pages, the murmur of lessons being taught and learned. America, it turned out, was willing to educate its captives. Classes emerged in the camp halls and under shade structures built to escape the desert heat. English lessons were led by teachers from nearby towns who volunteered their time. Woodworking and basic carpentry were taught by ranchers who doubled as guards. Even mathematics and basic literacy courses were organized by the prisoners themselves, the more educated teaching those who had come from rural villages with little schooling. Some men hunched over makeshift desks, sounding out English words with careful concentration. Others learned to measure wood and drive nails straight, the smell of pine shavings clinging to their clothes. At night, the barracks glowed softly with lamplight as men copied vocabulary into notebooks, whispering to themselves, "Hello, thank you, water, cowboy." It was a freedom they had never anticipated. Inside the fence, paradoxically, their minds expanded. One prisoner later reflected in writing, "I learned more in captivity than in all my years of imperial education. Behind barbed wire I discovered books were not just tools of propaganda." The irony cut deep. Under the watch of supposed enemies, they found space to think freely for the first time in years. Music wove through the nights as well. Japanese who had carried small instruments, harmonicas, flutes, began to play, at first only traditional folk songs that reminded them of home. Then, daringly, some began attempting American cowboy songs they had overheard. Soon small musical groups formed, blending the melodies of two worlds. Guards sometimes paused during their rounds to listen, standing quietly at a respectful distance before moving on. For the prisoners, it was deeply unsettling how easily they could reproduce the sounds of a culture they had been taught to see as inferior and corrupt. The contradictions deepened with every passing week. Camp newspapers appeared, printed on basic presses filled with essays, poetry, news summaries, and even humor columns. Some issues carried philosophical discussions, others offered creative writing in Japanese script. In one camp newsletter, an anonymous essay asked openly, "We were told we represented the pinnacle of Asian civilization, yet the cowboy feeds us better than our own leaders ever did. What does this mean?" Such words might have been dangerous thought crimes back home. Here they were printed and distributed, read by hundreds. Beyond the wire, work continued across the Southwest. Prisoners harvested cotton under the Arizona sun, helped with cattle drives in New Mexico, and worked irrigation systems that kept crops alive in the desert. The smell of leather, the sound of cattle, the taste of dust in their mouths, it all became woven into their daily existence. Some grew quietly proud of their labor, developing calluses on their hands and a dark tan on their faces. They began to understand the satisfaction of work well done, separate from ideology or national duty. One guard recalled a moment that stayed with him for decades. A Japanese prisoner, young and thin, had finished repairing a broken water pump on a ranch. The rancher walked over, inspected the work, and said simply, "Good job. Thank you." The prisoner froze. In the Imperial Army, soldiers were not thanked, they simply performed their duty. Gratitude suggested equality, something unthinkable between ranks. Yet here was an American cowboy, weathered and genuine, treating him as an equal in honest work. The young man bowed instinctively, then awkwardly extended his hand for a handshake as he had seen others do. The rancher took it firmly. Later that night, the prisoner told his bunkmate, "That handshake unsettled me more than surrender did." But not all prisoners embraced this transformation. Some hardened themselves deliberately, sneering at those who smiled at guards or seemed to enjoy their work. They called them traitors, men corrupted by enemy softness. They reminded others of their duty to the emperor, their obligation to resist spiritually even if physically captured. Tensions simmered. American officials documented the need to separate militant prisoners from those who simply wanted to survive and return home. The barbed wire contained not just bodies but ideological battles, old certainties fighting against new realities. Still, the cowboy presence remained a constant unspoken lesson. The prisoners watched their guards play cards under lamplight, laugh freely without fear of superior officers, ride horses with natural skill, work hard without being forced. Authority here was carried not in shouted commands, but in the tilt of a hat, the calm tone of voice, the steady competence of action. To men raised under rigid military hierarchy where even a wrong glance could bring punishment, this was profoundly confusing. How could order exist without terror? How could men respect leaders who did not demand absolute obedience? One night, a prisoner recorded his observations. I watched a cowboy tend his horse after work, speaking softly to it, checking its hooves with care. I saw more respect in that simple act than in 1,000 salutes to officers who only demanded, never gave. It was a revelation he had not expected, that authority could be gentle, that strength did not require cruelty. Humor, too, began to bridge the divide between captors and captives. In one camp, prisoners played baseball, a sport completely foreign to them, while guards attempted to explain the rules. When a prisoner finally hit the ball and ran to third base instead of first, both sides erupted in laughter. The guard who was coaching didn't yell or punish, he just laughed harder and redirected the confused player. It was absurd. Enemies sharing laughter over a game. Yet in that absurdity lay a truth the Japanese could not ignore: humanity persisted even across the deepest divides. And so the internal conflict sharpened. Was this kindness genuine, or was it a subtle form of psychological warfare? Could men raised to believe in the supremacy of Yamato spirit accept dignity from those they had called barbarians? Every meal, every fair wage, every moment of laughter pressed the question deeper. Some answered with stubborn defiance, clinging to old pride and identity. Others began silently to wonder if everything they had been taught was wrong. The camp's routines might have seemed ordinary to outside observers: work, meals, rest, yet for the prisoners each day chipped away at certainties they had carried since childhood. Barbed wire kept their bodies enclosed, but inside that fence, ideas moved freely. They debated, they studied, they played, and slowly a different understanding of freedom began to take shape. As winter approached and the desert nights grew cold, the prisoners huddled in their bunks, blankets pulled tight, breath visible in the frigid air. Outside, lanterns burned steadily, and the cowboys paced their rounds, boots crunching on frozen ground. Through the thin walls came the faint sound of a harmonica playing a lonesome tune. Some prisoners closed their eyes and let it carry them away from their worries. Others lay awake, troubled by the realization that captivity had given them something more dangerous than hardship, an idea of freedom that could never be unlearned. And in the silence before sleep, one whispered question passed from bunk to bunk, a question no one could safely answer aloud: if this is how America treats its prisoners, how free must its citizens be? The war ended not with thunder in the camps, but with quiet announcements. Word filtered through in August 1945. Japan had surrendered. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio. Atomic bombs had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The divine nation had fallen. The men sat in stunned silence on their bunks, staring at their hands, the wooden floor, the walls that had contained them. Some wept openly, overcome by shame and grief. Others clenched their fists, unable to process a world where the emperor admitted defeat. A few sat stone-faced, their entire worldview crumbling around them. But outside the wire, the cowboys continued as they always had, feeding cattle, mending fences, riding out at dawn to check the herds. For the prisoners, this contrast was almost unbearable. The empire had promised eternal glory and delivered atomic devastation. The cowboy had never promised anything, yet he endured, steady and unchanged. Repatriation began slowly in the months that followed. Ships prepared to carry the defeated back across the Pacific. Many prisoners felt relief at the prospect of finally going home, but there was also a deep, complex reluctance, an unease they struggled to name or admit. They had entered America with absolute certainty that it was barbaric, that it was spiritually corrupt, that it was inferior to the purity of Japanese civilization. They now prepared to leave carrying contradictions they could not resolve, full stomachs, memories of fair treatment, and songs they had learned from cowboys they were supposed to hate. Letters preserved from those final months reveal the profound dissonance. One soldier wrote to his brother, "I returned to you changed. The Americans did not beat me, they fed me until I was ashamed to eat. They did not humiliate me, they paid me for my work. They treated me as if I still possessed human dignity." Another described the cowboys specifically. "They work harder than anyone I knew in the army, yet they live without fear. Their discipline comes from within, not from the sword. I will remember them always." It was in small moments, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, that the transformation had occurred. A cowboy sharing water during the hottest part of the day. A piece of watermelon offered without ceremony in August heat. A harmonica tune drifting across the fence on the evening wind. For some it was the sound of spurs on a wooden porch, ringing like small bells. For others it was the sight of a cowboy tipping his hat in simple courtesy, without mockery or triumph. These gestures lodged in memory like stones in a riverbed, shaping the flow of thought around them. The Americans had not set out to convert them. The cowboys were not propagandists or ideologues, they simply were, and in their being they demonstrated something the prisoners had never encountered: authority without brutality, order without fear, strength expressed through competence rather than cruelty. The prisoners began to construct stories about the cowboys among themselves, half admiring, half mythologizing. They said cowboys bowed to no emperor because they needed none. They said the land was so vast that a man could ride for days and never reach a boundary. They said their freedom came not from permission but from the land itself. These were not lessons written in manuals or taught in classes. They were impressions absorbed slowly, reshaping how the Japanese saw both America and themselves. When the first groups finally boarded ships for home, many carried these impressions like contraband hidden in their hearts. Post-war Japan was a landscape of devastation, cities reduced to ash, millions homeless, the economy shattered, foreign occupation beginning. Yet in their minds, some carried memories of wheat fields under endless sky, the bitter taste of abundant coffee, the sight of men who worked without being driven by fear. A few even tried to recreate fragments of what they had experienced. In the decades that followed, Western-themed clubs emerged in Japan where men wore cowboy hats, played American folk music, and dreamed of the open spaces they had glimpsed through barbed wire. Some named their small farms with English words, quiet tributes to a place that had imprisoned their bodies but somehow freed something in their minds. Historians who later studied their letters and memoirs found a consistent pattern. The encounter with cowboys left marks deeper than anyone recognized at the time. It wasn't that every Japanese prisoner abandoned old beliefs or embraced American democracy. But seeds had been planted, seeds of doubt about the myths they had been taught, seeds of respect for a way of life that seemed both foreign and strangely admirable. As one former prisoner admitted decades later in an interview, "I went to America as an enemy of everything it represented. I did not leave as a friend, that would be too much to claim. But I left with respect. The cowboy taught me something about freedom that no propaganda could counter." The Americans themselves often saw it simply as doing their duty, following the Geneva Convention, treating prisoners fairly, putting them to productive work. But perhaps unknowingly they demonstrated something profound: that power need not crush, that strength could be quiet, that freedom could be embodied in the everyday life of a rancher who never spoke of ideology but simply lived with dignity. Yet for the prisoners, this generosity brought not only gratitude but deep shame. They knew their families had suffered under bombing, starvation, and atomic horror, while they had eaten well and worked in relative safety. This guilt was crushing for many. Some dreaded returning home, feared admitting how they had lived in enemy hands. One man wrote bluntly, "We lived better as prisoners than our people did as free citizens. What does that say about everything we were taught to believe?" The question haunted them as they boarded ships, as the engines turned, as the American coastline receded behind them. At the docks, some looked back toward the desert interior where they had spent their captivity, trying to fix the image in memory one final time. The trains had carried them inland when they first arrived. Ships now carried them away. Through portholes they watched the American coast disappear, saw the mountains fade, remembered the vast plains they had crossed. Some carried books they had studied in camp. Others carried small carvings of horses they had made from scrap wood. Many carried only memories, but all of them carried questions about what freedom truly meant and why they had tasted it fully, only in defeat. The ships rolled across the Pacific. Through small windows, prisoners watched the ocean, remembering the land behind them, fields they had worked, food they had eaten, songs they had heard. A boy on a California dock waved at the departing ship, not knowing the men aboard had once been his nation's bitter enemies. A distant figure on horseback appeared briefly on a coastal hill, silhouetted against the sky, then vanished into the landscape. The prisoners pressed their faces to glass as if trying to preserve the image forever. Years later, in interviews and written memoirs, many still spoke of that image above all others, not the battles of Saipan or Okinawa, not the ruins of Tokyo, but a cowboy leaning against a fence in the desert, spurs shining in the sun. The memory carried both comfort and disturbance, a reminder that their war had ended not in the cruelty they expected, but in a lesson they never anticipated receiving. And so the story endures not in treaties or official histories, but in the paradox of men who discovered freedom while imprisoned, who met America not through speeches or propaganda but through the dust, leather, and quiet dignity of cowboys. It is a story of enemies disarmed not by weapons but by bread, by coffee, by simple gestures of respect across the chasm of war. The ships disappeared over the western horizon, but the memories remained, carried in the hearts of men who had once believed they served a divine empire destined to rule Asia. They had met their captors wearing boots and hats, speaking softly, working hard, and they could never forget them. And in that unforgettable image lay a final question that lingered for the rest of their lives. If the cowboy was real, truly real, then what else about America had they been lied to about? What other truths had been hidden behind the propaganda of their youth? The question had no easy answer, but it followed them home, across the ocean, into the ruins of their defeated nation. And perhaps in its own quiet way that question helped plant seeds for the transformation of post-war Japan, a nation that would eventually rebuild not in isolation, but in partnership with the very enemy whose cowboys had shown them an unexpected face of freedom.